Darwinism by Rich von Holt. Spencer Jones, a man in his 30s, his black messy hair desperately in need of acquaintance with both shampoo and scissors, flopped over his forehead. The white tank top he wore, originally white anyway, now featured an abstract expressionist painting of his own blood. His black dress pants, likely purchased during a more optimistic phase of his life, completed the ensemble of a man who had clearly made some questionable life choices. The absence of shoes on his feet made the whole situation seem somehow more vulnerable. Standing over him, Genesis looked like she had walked straight out of an underground fighting championship. Hispanic, muscular, and of average height, she wore the unofficial uniform of professional ass-kickers everywhere: black boots, black tank top, and black pants. The UFC boxing gloves on her hands weren't just fashion accessories. They were tools of her trade, as Spencer was painfully discovering. Genesis threw a punch with her left hand that connected with Spencer's face, immediately following it with a right that made the first one seem gentle. The sound was distinctive. Spencer spat blood, or rather, he attempted to spit blood at the floor. Instead, in a moment of cosmic comedy, the blood went everywhere except where he intended, splattering all over his already ruined shirt. He looked down at himself. "Oh man," Spencer muttered to himself, his voice carrying the disappointed tone. The chamber around them had all the charm of a serial killer's weekend project. Dark and dingy, with ambiance that was uninviting. In the far corner, a single work light was plugged in, casting dramatic shadows. Genesis's shadow loomed over Spencer's hunched form. Watching from the opposite corner was Grayson, a Persian man in his 40s who had clearly confused kidnapping and torture with upscale nightclub appearance. His dark blue shiny suit reflected what little light the room offered, paired with a black dress shirt that probably cost more than Spencer's monthly rent. His slick dark hair completed the look of someone who might either offer you a business deal or have you thrown into the trunk of a car, possibly both, in that order. Grayson turned his attention to Genesis, his voice carrying a casual tone. "Ask him where the girl is," he said, more statement than question. Genesis, ever the professional, turned to Spencer. "Where's Aurora?" she demanded. Spencer responded, "I already told you, I don't know." Grayson's expression shifted to one of mild inconvenience. "That's not what I want to hear," he said, his disappointment palpable. Genesis looked to Grayson, seeking permission. Grayson gave a slight nod and she delivered a right hook with enthusiasm, sending Spencer crashing to the ground, chair and all. He landed awkwardly on his right side, still tied to the chair. Grayson approached Spencer with a slow, deliberate walk. He knelt beside the fallen man, entering Spencer's personal space with zero regard for social norms or dental hygiene boundaries. "I'm getting tired, Spencer," Grayson announced. Spencer's vision blurred, the world around him going soft at the edges. As Grayson leaned in closer, his face gradually came into focus, transforming from an abstract blob to the defined features of a man who clearly enjoyed making others uncomfortable. "I don't know who Aurora is," Spencer replied. Grayson, apparently satisfied with whatever he saw in Spencer's battered face, made an executive decision. "I'm going to let you go. Please bring me Aurora in the next 3 days or I will kill you," he stated with a casual tone. With business apparently concluded, Grayson stood up and walked away. As a parting gift, he nodded to Genesis, who delivered a farewell kick to Spencer's ribs. "Cut," came a voice from off-screen. The director strode onto the warehouse movie set. Mid-30s with a build that suggested he had once considered getting into shape but then discovered takeout apps, he removed his glasses dramatically. "Genesis, you have to kick him in his face," he explained with patience. "That's where the camera is. I want to see the bottom of your foot." The crew scurried around, adjusting lights, cameras, and set pieces with frantic energy. Equipment cases were strewn about the concrete floor. Off to the side, Milton Schlesinger stood behind a monitor, watching the playback of the scene with focused concentration. A Jewish American man in his 40s with a baldness situation that had clearly surrendered to genetics, his head featured the classic horseshoe of gray curly hair. His casual attire suggested a man who had reached that sweet spot in his career where he no longer needed to impress anyone. Standing next to Milton, visible only to him, was Darwin, a tall, skinny African-American man in his 20s. His white dress shirt, black suspenders, and black pants gave him a distinctive look. His hair was styled in a ponytail with shaved sides, and he adjusted his glasses with nervous energy. He was an adult imaginary friend. "What are we thinking, Millie?" Darwin asked, leaning in. Milton continued to stare at the monitor with intensity. Darwin, apparently unfamiliar with the concept of comfortable silence, pressed on. "Mill, talk to me. Did you like that take? I thought it was good. Are you happy with the way it's coming out?" "I think it's cool." Before Milton could acknowledge his imaginary companion, Martha Marty approached with a stack of papers. In her early 50s, Martha had the look of a woman who had fought her way up the corporate ladder and now used it to beat back anyone who challenged her authority. Her business suit and dress shirt were as crisp as her personality, and her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to be performing double duty as an improvised facelift. Darwin, sensing a disturbance, walked around the monitor and stared at them both with curious expression. "Milton," Martha said. "Hello, Ms. Marty," Milton replied with forced formality. Milton subtly signaled Darwin to leave. Darwin responded with a smirk that suggested compliance was optional before heading off to the catering table. "How many times do I have to tell you, just because I'm the boss now doesn't mean you have to be so formal," Martha said. "Sorry, Martha," Milton replied automatically. "Don't be sorry either," Martha countered. While this exchange of professional awkwardness continued, Darwin surveyed the catering table with enthusiasm. His eyes widened at the array of sweets laid out. "Listen, I want to make some changes to the upcoming episodes," Martha said, dropping the bombshell. Milton's face froze. "But we're scheduled to shoot tomorrow." "We have time," Martha assured him. "They're minor tweaks." She handed him the stack of paper. "Here's my notes. Read them over and get me the revisions by tomorrow morning." Martha exits. "Sure thing," Milton called after her. Darwin returned clutching a Twinkie, his face a mixture of triumph and concern. "Did she really just ask for you to revise all those episodes?" "Yep," Milton confirmed. "Can she do that?" Darwin asked. "She just did," Milton replied, the two simple words carrying a universe of frustration. Darwin's face contorted into an expression of sympathetic outrage. "If you want to go outside to scream, I'll go with you, because I kind of do." "No, it's what I signed up for," Milton said. Milton exited the set, his shoulders slumped. "Milton, are you serious?" "Milton," Darwin called after him, following. Meanwhile, the director walked toward the monitor. Spencer wriggled in his chair, adjusting himself, trying to find a comfortable position. Genesis and Grayson moved back into their positions. "All right, everyone, we're going to go again," the director announced. "Quiet on set." The crew adjusted the lights once more. The director of photography fiddled with the camera focus, squinting through the viewfinder. "And action!" the director called out. Milton drove his car with cautious and precision. The midday sun filtered through the windshield, creating glare. Darwin occupied the passenger seat, his lanky frame folded into the space. "I can't believe we have to rewrite all those episodes," Darwin complained. "Who does she think she is? She just became the new boss. We already filmed a bunch of episodes." He paused for a moment, a dramatic beat silence. "Mill, I can't believe you're taking this so lightly," he continued when no such agreement came. Milton navigated the road calmly. Up ahead, a couple of cars weaved through traffic with entitled aggression. Darwin's attention flitted to the vehicular chaos. "Look at these guys. They're all over the road." His gaze shifted to a passenger in the car next to them who had the misfortune of making eye contact with a figment of Milton's imagination. Darwin's face contorted into an expression of road rage. "And what is this guy looking at?" "Yeah, up yours, buddy," he shouted, apparently forgetting that he was invisible to everyone except the driver of his own car. He turned back to Milton with indignation. "Milton, I can't believe none of this is bothering you," he said. "I can make it work," Milton replied. "They're simple changes. Take a scene out here, put one in there." Darwin slumped in his seat dramatically. I'm just so annoyed right now. It's going to be fine, Darwin, Milton assured him. Milton activated his turn signal with deliberation. Darwin perked up. This isn't where we live. Where are we going? Milton pulled over and parallel parked. He unbuckled his seatbelt decisively. You can come in or stay in the car, he offered. Darwin slouched back, his face a portrait of petulant protest. I think I'll stay here. Okay, suit yourself, Milton replied with nonchalance. Milton exited the car, leaving Darwin alone with his imaginary thoughts, which was quite the existential situation when you thought about it. I can't believe he's okay with all of this, Darwin muttered to himself. Darwin watched as Milton approached modestly. Milton knocked on the door with a specific rhythm that suggested familiarity. The door swung open to reveal Aaron Aronovitz, a tall, thin man with curly salt and pepper hair. He stood there in boxer shorts and a purple robe, looking like he had been woken from a nap he wasn't taking. He placed a hand on Milton's shoulder with the casual intimacy of an old friend, and they both disappeared into the house. Darwin's face registered shock. Oh, hell no! Ron, he exclaimed, the nickname carrying a history that suggested complication. Inside Aronovitz's house, the two men walked through a living room. I'll get to it eventually. The place had the lived-in comfort of a man who had given up. So what brings you here to see me? Aronowitz asked, his voice carrying a mild curiosity. I need your advice, Milton replied, getting straight to the point. On what? Aronowitz prompted. Well, you remember Martha, Milton asked. Marty? Aronowitz clarified, raising his eyebrows. Yes, Milton confirmed. The scene shifted to the kitchen, a space that looked like it had been renovated sometime during the Clinton era and had been holding on bravely ever since. Milton pulled out a chair from under the island and sat. Aronovitz opened the refrigerator. He retrieved a small glass from a cabinet and poured the orange juice with precision. Would you like some? He offered. No, I'm okay, Milton declined. At that moment, Darwin materialized to Milton's left, perching on a stool. I'll take some, he announced, apparently having abandoned his car protest. Milton's head whipped around, startled. What are you doing here? It's Ron. I have to see what this guy's up to, Darwin explained. Aronowitz observed Milton knowingly. I see you're still doing that. Milton flinched. Huh? He paused for a beat. Oh yeah, right. He collected himself, returning to the original purpose of his visit. Well, as you know, Spencer Jones' Season 1 has been picked up and we're in production. And she asked me to revise the script and we're 2 episodes away from completion. He paused again. And I'm just having a hard time really with this deadline. Another beat. Is there anyone higher I can go to? Aronowitz sipped his orange juice thoughtfully. Meanwhile, Darwin had somehow acquired a bagel and was staring at Aronowitz with intense scrutiny. You know, Milton, I was stupid for passing up the series, Aronowitz admitted. And you know that's why I've been fired. He pulled out a stool opposite Milton and sat carefully. And as far as someone higher up, there's the board, but she's a part of them, so no. He paused, giving weight to his next question. How bad are the changes? Enough to keep me up all night, Milton replied. And isn't this what you've been working for? Aronowitz asked. Well, yeah, but it's already been approved, Milton countered. No, Milton, the idea has been approved, Aronowitz corrected patiently. This is bound to happen with this series or the next. He paused. They approve the idea, not the script. They are able to make changes throughout the whole process. Milton's face fell. So I should just bite the bullet, suck it up, and do it? If you want to see it through to the end, yeah, Aronowitz confirmed. Milton sighed with resignation. I guess you're right. I always valued your friendship. Hey, Darwin interjected. Milton side-eyed Darwin. Darwin had somehow acquired a glass of orange juice and was clutching it with proprietary air. How are you holding up? Milton asked Aronowitz. I'm good. I cashed out my 401k and I'm living the life, Aronowitz answered with synthetic brightness. Really? Milton asked, his tone carrying skepticism. No, Milton. Not really, Aronowitz admitted, dropping the facade. I'm bored, I'm miserable, but I have an investment opportunity that I'm acting on. He gulped his orange juice enthusiastically. Darwin mirrored the action, taking a synchronized gulp of his own imaginary juice. A streaming company approached me to head up the original content distribution, Aronowitz continued, a glimmer of genuine excitement breaking through his earlier despondency. Milton perked up. Ooh, how can I submit to that? You wouldn't, Aronowitz replied. You would have to do the production and send it over. Oh, I see, Milton said, his disappointment palpable. There are guys half your age writing, directing, and producing, Aronowitz continued. After they shoot, they edit in the same night. He rose from his stool carefully and reopened the refrigerator, extracting the orange juice once more. In order to get things done, you have to do them yourself, he said. If you don't want to do the revisions, you have to be your own producer. Aronowitz poured himself another glass of orange juice with deliberate care. In order to do it, you have to let go and not hold on so tight of everything, he continued. Let go of the past and embrace the future. Milton contemplated this advice thoughtfully. Meanwhile, a look of absolute terror spread across Darwin's face. You know what? Milton said, his voice carrying a new resolve. I will take some orange juice. Milton pushed open the door to his absurdly cramped apartment. Darwin followed him in, his face contorted in judgment mixed with reluctant acceptance. The apartment was small. To the right of the entrance sat a flat-screen TV that Milton had splurged on during a brief period of financial optimism. It was mounted in the corner. Across from it slouched a sofa that had clearly seen better days. Directly ahead from the entrance stood a dining table that was charitably described as two-seater, but realistically could only accommodate two people if they both agreed not to breathe simultaneously. To the left was what passed for a kitchen, essentially 3 cabinets, a sink, and an appliance or two huddled together for moral support. Wedged uncomfortably between the kitchen and the dining area were a bathroom and bedroom, both sized for occupants of Lilliputian proportions. Milton made a beeline for the dining table, unloading his laptop from his messenger bag with determined focus. Darwin, meanwhile, flopped onto the sofa casually. Can you believe Aaron Ron? Darwin asked. Guy's a mess. And what are you doing now? Are you going to actually rewrite the scene? Milton didn't respond as he fired up his laptop and opened Skype. A few moments later, the screen filled with the face of Victoria, early 30s. She wore her curly hair tied up in a bun that somehow managed to look both hastily assembled and intentionally stylish. Her 50s-style reading glasses perched on her nose gave her a professorial air, while her red hooded sweatshirt suggested she was the kind of person who prioritized comfort over appearance, but somehow still looked put together. Hey Milton, Victoria said, her voice crackling slightly over the less than perfect internet connection. Victoria, how are you? How's North Carolina? Milton replied, his posture straightening slightly. Darwin, clearly uninterested in this exchange, picked up a magazine from the cocktail table. I guess Milton and Victoria's going to do the boyfriend-girlfriend now. Whatever, Darwin mumbled with resigned disdain. Milton didn't even acknowledge Darwin's comment, didn't so much as twitch an eyebrow in his direction. This was clearly a dynamic they'd established long ago. It's good, just really cold outside, Victoria said, hugging herself slightly. Well, you have that nice sweatshirt to keep you warm, Milton observed. Upon closer inspection, Victoria wasn't wearing a hooded sweatshirt at all, but rather a wool-red Christmas sweater with the Grinch prominently displayed. Yeah, it's nice. Thank you for sending it to me, Victoria said, smiling genuinely. You're welcome, Milton replied, his voice softening. How was the shoot? Victoria asked, shifting the conversation to work matters. It was good. I'm going to be up late tonight, Milton said, resignation creeping into his voice. Rewriting, Victoria said, not a question, a statement of fact. Yep, Milton confirmed. Martha told me today during the shoot to rewrite the remaining episodes. He reached into his messenger bag dramatically, then pulled out a stack of notes so thick it might qualify as a weapon in some jurisdictions. He held it up to the laptop camera. Whoa, she needs it tomorrow? Victoria asked, her eyes widening behind her glasses. I don't know, maybe the next episode, Milton said with a slight shrug before adding after a beat. This is just the complete season. I have to go through it to find her notes. I skimmed it. It doesn't look so bad. Oh, baby, you're going to be tired tomorrow, Victoria said, her voice carrying sympathy and concern. Darwin had meanwhile assumed a fully horizontal position on the sofa, continuing to flip through his magazine with focused detachment. You know what, Victoria? I'm really tired, Darwin muttered to himself. Tired of you. It was just loud enough for Milton to hear, who responded with a side-eye glance that could have frozen lava. I'll be okay. I'm going to get to it. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Have a good night, Milton said to Victoria. Darwin suddenly sat up, tossing the magazine onto the table dramatically. Okay, love you, bye, Victoria said, her smile genuine despite the pixelated video quality. Bye, Darwin interjected loudly. Love you too, bye, Milton replied to Victoria, completely ignoring Darwin's interruption. He signed off Skype and immediately buried himself in the notes, typing away with intensity. Darwin got up and headed to the kitchen, his movements exaggeratedly casual. You want something from the kitchen, Miller? Milton remained hunched over his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard, completely absorbed in his work. The lack of response didn't seem to surprise Darwin. Okay, Mill, I'll just get something for myself, Darwin announced to the room. He reached for the refrigerator handle, but something bizarre happened. His hand passed right through it. A look of confusion crossed his face. He tried again with the same supernatural result. His hand simply glided through the solid refrigerator door. Darwin stared at his hand with shock. He slowly turned his head to look back at Milton, his face a portrait of existential crisis. Milton, oblivious to this reality-shattering moment, continued typing with laser focus, completely immersed in his rewriting task. Can you get me a root beer? Milton asked casually, not looking up from his screen. Darwin stood there, speechless, squeezing his hand. His mind was clearly racing through possibilities, none of them comforting. Sure, Mill, he finally managed to say, his voice slightly higher than normal. With visible trepidation, Darwin reached for the refrigerator again. This time, miraculously, his hand connected with the handle. He could feel it cold, solid, real. He pulled the door open, staring at the illuminated interior. He took a deep breath. On set, in an office setting, Spencer sat at his desk. His clean-shaven face had that sheen of someone who spent way too much time on their morning grooming routine despite knowing full well that literally no one in the office would notice or care. His hair was parted to the side with precision. He wore what could only be described as the uniform of middle management aspirants everywhere. A white shirt and tie combo with black pants that were just slightly too tight around the waist. Spencer stared at his computer screen with vacant expression. He wasn't looking at anything on the screen, more looking through it, his mind wandering to places far more interesting than whatever spreadsheet or email chain was currently displayed. With languid movement, Spencer grabbed his mouse. The decisive click as he opened Google Chrome was perhaps the most committed action he'd taken all day. He typed www.google.com into the browser, because apparently typing directly into the search bar was too technologically advanced for him. In the search field, he began typing, "Who is Aurora?" His fingers hovered over the keyboard. With a quick flurry of backspacing, he deleted Aurora, erasing the name. Just then, as if summoned by the digital erasure of her name, a tall blonde woman walked by his desk. The blonde woman, dressed in a red dress that somehow managed to be both office appropriate and completely distracting, moved past with confidence. Spencer's head swiveled to follow her. His neck made an audible cracking sound from the sudden movement, causing the coworker at the next desk to look up momentarily before returning to their own existential dread. As the blonde woman disappeared, Spencer went deep into thought, his eyes glazing over. In the city streets, Fantasy Spencer was everything that Office Spencer wasn't. This Spencer had a gruff face with the perfect amount of 5 o'clock shadow, not enough to look homeless, just enough to look dangerous. His hair was spiked in that way that suggested he either spent 2 hours on it or rolled directly out of bed. You couldn't tell which, and that was the point. He wore an olive-colored long jacket with the collar popped. Underneath was a dark gray, blue, and red plaid-collared shirt that somehow managed to clash with everything while still looking intentional. To complete the ensemble, he sported a red and black checkerboard tie. This Spencer sat on a motorcycle, not straddling it normally, but perched on it. He took a long, dramatic drag from a cigarette, exhaling the smoke in a way that he clearly thought made him look mysterious and attractive. Across the street walked the blonde woman, wearing the same red dress from the office, which in this fantasy context suddenly seemed more femme fatale than business casual. She moved with purpose, completely unaware of Fantasy Spencer's existence, or perhaps painfully aware and choosing to ignore him. With the dramatic flair of someone who believes they're being filmed, Spencer flicked away his cigarette, sending it arcing through the air before it landed directly next to a "no littering" sign. He dismounted the motorcycle with what he imagined was feline grace, but was more like a man with lower back problems. He began following the blonde woman, attempting to be discreet, but moving with all the stealth of a toddler. He crossed the street at an angle that he thought would keep him hidden, but would have instantly alerted anyone with peripheral vision to his presence. Spencer followed her for about half a block, maintaining what he considered a safe distance, but was close enough that she would be able to smell his excessive cologne. The blonde woman suddenly turned down an alley, the kind of alley that in movies always leads to either a dramatic revelation or a mugging. Spencer stopped at the corner, his brain engaging for the first time in this fantasy. He waited and thought for a beat, clearly warring between his desire to follow the mysterious woman and his instinct for self-preservation. With the resolve of someone who has watched too many action movies, he took a deep breath and turned to walk down the alley, his footsteps echoing dramatically on the pavement. He had taken exactly one step, literally one, when a van that could only be described as a serial killer special pulled up and stopped directly in front of him. It was white, windowless, probably had free candy written on the side in invisible ink. Spencer's reaction was instantaneous and anything but heroic. He pivoted and ran out of the alley with the speed of someone who just remembered they left the oven on. His fantasy persona of tough guy completely shattered. He barreled back onto the street, looking frantically for a place to hide. His eyes landed on a neon sign flickering above a doorway. A bar. Not a nice bar. The kind of bar where the health inspector leaves with bribes and nightmares. Spencer darted inside. The bar was the kind of establishment where dreams came to die and liver disease came to thrive. It was dimly lit, not for ambiance, but because half the light bulbs had burned out and no one had bothered to replace them. A few locals sat at the bar, hunched over their drinks with the posture of people who had found their life's purpose at the bottom of a glass. Spencer approached the bar with the caution of someone entering enemy territory. Behind the counter stood a bartender with her back turned, a tall blonde in a white tank top, busy cleaning drinking glasses that somehow managed to look dirtier after she wiped them. Spencer sat on a bar stool that creaked ominously under his weight, threatening structural failure with every slight movement. "Excuse me, can I get a club soda?" Spencer said, his voice cracking slightly at the end. The bartender turned around, revealing herself to be the blonde woman from the office. Without a word, she slammed a glass of club soda on the counter, filled with so much ice it was basically a frozen block with a hint of liquid. Spencer, startled by this development in his own fantasy, picked up the club soda with the tentative movement of someone accepting a live grenade. "You're never going to find what you're looking for," the blonde woman said, her voice somehow both sultry and threatening. "You want what you can't have, Spencer." Her face began to blur. The sound of his name echoed and distorted, repeating with increasing volume and decreasing clarity. "Spencer, Spencer, Spencer." Back as the office, Spencer jolted awake at his desk with the violent suddenness of someone who just dreamed they were falling. A small puddle of drool had formed on his keyboard, shorting out the J key, which would cause him minor inconvenience for the rest of the day. "Cut!" bellowed an unseen director from somewhere off in the distance. Spencer blinked rapidly. the line between dream and reality blurring for a moment as he sat in his ergonomically questionable office chair, wondering if he had just been in a dream or if his entire life was an elaborate film set. The existential crisis lasted approximately 3 seconds before he noticed his boss staring at him through the glass partition of his office, eyebrows raised in that particular way that suggested a performance review might be coming sooner than scheduled. Milton stood behind the monitor with his hand over his mouth in that way people do when they're desperately trying to hide their anxiety but might as well be wearing a neon sign. He clutched a stack of script pages that looked like they had been through a war dog-eared corner, coffee stains, and what appeared to be a suspicious smudge of mustard on page 37. The pages were held together by a binder clip that was clearly struggling with its life purpose. The director walked onto the set with the self-important stride of someone who had just read an article about commanding presence in a Hollywood trade magazine. He was gesturing wildly to the actors who nodded with the vacant expressions of people who had stopped listening 3 sentences ago but were still being paid to look interested. Meanwhile, the crew bustled around resetting lights, cameras, and sets with the coordinated chaos of a beehive. A gaffer adjusted a light while nearly falling off a ladder. A production assistant ran by with 6 coffees and the desperate look of someone who knew they'd forgotten somebody's specific milk preference, and a sound guy held his boom mic like he was fishing for compliments. "Milton!" The voice cut through the ambient noise. Martha approached him with the determined gait of someone who had important news to deliver and exactly 3 minutes to do it before her next crisis. "Milton, that was a great take. I love the revisions," Martha said, her smile showing too many teeth to be completely genuine, but not so many that you'd think she was about to bite you. "Thank you, Ms. Marty," Milton replied, his posture straightening slightly. "Martha. Milton. Call me Martha," she corrected, with the practiced patience of someone who had made this exact same request approximately 47 times before. "Yes, Martha," Milton nodded, looking like he was mentally filing this information away in a drawer. "Listen, I really love what you did, but," Martha began, her voice taking on that inflection that immediately signals bad news is coming. "But," Milton asked, his eyebrows shooting up so quickly they almost left his face entirely. "The heads want to move up the release date," Martha announced, with the casual air of someone saying they'd changed the coffee brand in the break room, not fundamentally altered a production schedule. "But we're still shooting," Milton protested, his voice cracking slightly. "Yeah, all hands on deck," Martha replied with a dismissive wave. Milton responded, which was clearly code for, "I have several concerns and objections but lack the professional standing to voice any of them." Darwin appeared behind the monitor, materializing with the suddenness of a sitcom neighbor. He had the smug look of someone who was about to witness disaster but wouldn't be affected by it. "They're pushing it up about a month," Martha continued, her tone suggesting this was a minor inconvenience rather than a complete reshaping of everyone's lives. "That's a month from now," Milton pointed out, his face wearing the expression of someone who had just been told water is wet. "Yeah, so we're going to need the rest of the final episodes this Monday," Martha declared, her smile never wavering despite delivering what was essentially a death sentence to Milton's weekend. "But it's Friday and we're wrapping up," Milton said, his voice tinged with the desperate hope of someone trying to negotiate with an approaching tsunami. "We have to divide and conquer. I have to run," Martha responded with the breezy confidence of someone delegating a problem they would not personally have to solve. She smiled as she headed to the opposite side of the room, her walk somehow conveying both urgency and the fact that whatever fire she was off to put out next was more important than Milton's impending nervous breakdown. Milton's face had fallen faster than property values. His expression was a masterclass in silent suffering, the kind of look that screams, "I'm fine," while everything inside is clearly on fire. Darwin entered the scene eating a cheese Danish with the messy enthusiasm of someone who had no respect for the pastry, his shirt collecting crumbs. He approached Milton while taking another bite, sending a small avalanche of flaky pastry to the floor. "What's up, Mill?" Darwin asked through a mouthful of Danish, completely oblivious to the fact that Milton was mentally calculating how many hours of sleep he could sacrifice before hallucinations kicked in. Nothing, Milton replied with the brevity of someone who wanted to say, "Everything is terrible and I hate my life," but lacked both the time and emotional energy. "You sure, Mill?" Darwin pressed, pieces of cheese Danish threatening to escape his mouth with each syllable. His concern appeared genuine, but was undercut by his continued assault on the pastry, which was now approximately 60% consumed and 40% distributed across his person. "I have a lot of work to do. I'm going to need some time to get all of this done," Milton said, his voice flat as he walked towards the exit with the resigned shuffle of a man heading to his own execution. Darwin stood there, staring at Milton's retreating form while holding his cheese Danish mid-bite. A single crumb fell from his Danish and landed on the floor with what seemed, in that moment, like profound significance. Milton and Darwin sat in the waiting room of a therapist's office that seemed deliberately designed to make people feel uncomfortable. The chairs were that kind of firm that suggested they were chosen by someone who believed comfort encouraged lengthy stays, while the beige walls were adorned with framed inspirational quotes that had all the depth of a puddle. A ficus plant drooped sadly in the corner, clearly contemplating vegetative suicide. Milton was hunched over his phone, thumbs working furiously as he texted, his body language screaming, "Please don't talk to me," louder than any verbal request ever could. He positioned himself at a slight angle away from Darwin, the universal sign for, "I'm pretending you don't exist right now." Darwin, meanwhile, flipped through a magazine with the bored indifference of someone who had read the same 10 Ways to Improve Your Self-Esteem article approximately 47 times. The magazine was from 2018, which in waiting room time might as well have been the Renaissance period. "What you doing, Mill?" Darwin asked, despite the obvious answer being texting and the obvious subtext being "leave me alone." Milton laughed at something on his phone, a sound that seemed to physically pain Darwin, who was clearly desperate for attention. "Are you talking to your girlfriend?" Darwin pressed, his voice carrying that tone of someone who was asking a question but really making a judgment. Milton responded by ignoring Darwin so aggressively it almost became its own form of communication. He buried his face deeper into his phone, creating a physical barrier between them with the determination of someone building a sandbag wall. "What is it that we do here every week?" Darwin asked the room, pausing dramatically before adding, "We've been coming here for a year now." The question hung in the air. Just then, Dr. Frederick Gussman emerged from his office with the theatrical timing of a sitcom character. Late 30s, he wore a brown suit that looked like it had been specifically tailored to make him appear as dull as humanly possible. The brown vest underneath added an extra layer of tedium, while his gold tie struggled valiantly but unsuccessfully to introduce some personality into the ensemble. His white shirt was so crisp it could probably stand on its own, and his khaki plaid socks with brown pointed tip shoes suggested a man who believed his ankles were the appropriate place to express his wild side. His face featured the kind of scruff that indicated he thought about shaving every morning but couldn't quite commit to the effort. His sky blue eyes were the only feature that betrayed any hint of life in his otherwise beige existence, and his balding hair seemed to be retreating from his forehead with the same enthusiasm that most people retreated from boring conversations at parties. He clutched a clipboard with the white-knuckled grip of someone who believed it contained the secrets of the universe. "Milton, you ready?" Gussman asked, his voice carrying that blend of professional detachment and forced warmth that only therapists can truly master. Milton and Darwin stood up simultaneously. Milton continued to text, his attention never leaving the phone screen, while Darwin tossed the magazine onto the cocktail table with the casual disregard of someone who had never worked in customer service. As they approached the office, Milton grabbed the door handle and turned around with the sudden decisiveness of someone who had just remembered an important boundary. "Can you stay out in the lobby for a few?" Milton said, less a question and more a desperate plea poorly disguised as a casual request. "Again, I can never come in with you." "Why is that?" Darwin responded, his voice carrying the wounded indignation of someone who had been denied entry to an exclusive club. "Dar, I need my alone time right now," Milton said, his mispronunciation of now hanging awkwardly in the air between them. Mill, you always have your alone time, Darwin countered, his tone suggesting this was the greatest injustice since taxation without representation. Please, and we can hang out later. Promise, Milton offered, dangling future companionship. Promise? Darwin asked, his voice suddenly childlike, vulnerable in a way that made the exchange even more uncomfortable to witness. Yes, promise, Milton confirmed with the weariness of someone who had made and broken this exact promise countless times before. Milton shut the door with the gentle finality of someone closing a chapter they weren't particularly enjoying. Darwin stood there, staring at the closed door in his face, his expression a masterclass in betrayed expectations. Moments later, Darwin had transformed the waiting room into his personal stage. He now lay sprawled across several chairs, his body contorted into what he presumably thought was a convincing lamp impression, though it more closely resembled someone experiencing a moderate seizure. It was the kind of behavior that would make other patients request a different therapist if there had been any other patients present to witness it. He had inched his way closer to the door and was now listening with the intense concentration of someone trying to hear a whisper during a rock concert. I'm really stressed. The show is coming to an end, but my boss has me doing a lot of changes. Milton's voice came through the door, slightly muffled but still audible to Darwin's straining ears. And you don't like that? Gusman's voice followed, carrying that therapist's inflection that somehow turned every statement into a question about your childhood. No, it's fine. It's what I signed up for, Milton replied, before pausing and adding, but it's not that. I have a girlfriend now. Darwin's eyebrows shot up with such speed they threatened to leave his face entirely. And how's that going? Gusman asked, his tone suggesting mild interest, but his words carrying the weight of professional obligation. Good, Milton answered with the kind of repetition that immediately indicates things are not, in fact, good. I just feel like something's holding me down. Tell me about Darwin, Gusman said, changing direction with the subtle grace of someone making a U-turn. Darwin, Milton repeated, as if the name itself was a complete thought. After a beat that lasted slightly too long to be comfortable, he added, Darwin is Darwin. Inside the office, Milton lay on an old brown sofa that had absorbed years of anxiety, depression, and the occasional spilled coffee. The leather was cracked in places that aligned perfectly with the pressure points of human distress. Gusman wrote on a sheet of paper clipped to his clipboard, the scratching of his pen sounding ominous. Why is he still in your life? Gusman asked, the question cutting through the therapeutically appropriate silence. Darwin recoiled from the door as if it had suddenly become electrified. What do you mean why? He whispered indignantly to no one, his face a portrait of offended dignity. He quickly pressed his ear back against the door, not wanting to miss a single word of his own character assassination. Milton sat up on the sofa with the abrupt motion of someone who had just been asked if they'd committed a crime. Is he supposed to be gone by now? He asked, his face a mask of genuine confusion. What do you mean gone? Darwin hissed at the door, his expression suggesting he had just discovered a personal betrayal of historical proportions. Milton, are you taking the medication I prescribed to you? Gusman asked, his tone shifting from gentle inquiry to something closer to parental concern. Ah, yes, Milton replied with all the convincing power of a child denying they ate the cookies. Milton, by not taking them, you will continue to have episodes, Gusman said, his voice taking on that cadence therapists use when they're trying to sound non-judgmental while judging you quite severely. It's just that he hasn't been that much of a pain, Milton offered weakly. You're just learning to cope with him, Gusman replied, before adding after a perfectly timed pause. The goal is to rid him from your life so you can start living without interference. I'm not an interference, Darwin protested to the empty waiting room, his voice carrying the wounded outrage of someone who had just been described as a minor inconvenience rather than a vital presence. Milton, the weight you feel holding you back is Darwin, even though he's not so much of a bothersome. He's still around, Gusman continued, his grammatical stumble suggesting he wasn't quite as polished as his credentials might indicate. You've unconsciously chosen to ignore him, which helps with your outbursts. but in order to feel free, you must take the pills. Milton looked down at the ground with an expression of profound sadness, the kind usually reserved for commercials about abandoned pets. Darwin mirrored Milton's expression perfectly, looking at the ground with identical sadness, as if their emotions were synchronized by some cosmic force, or perhaps by something much more personal and complicated than either of them was ready to acknowledge. Milton parked his car in front of a CVS with the kind of awkward precision that suggested he'd spent way too long trying to get the perfect distance from the curb. The car, a mid-2000s sedan that was neither impressive enough to be noticed nor crappy enough to be interesting, sat idling with the rattle of a vehicle that had seen better days but was determined to soldier on through sheer mechanical stubbornness. The CVS loomed before them, its garish red and white signage practically screaming, "We have pharmaceuticals and also snacks." The parking lot was dotted with the usual collection of shopping carts that had escaped their designated corrals. Milton turned to Darwin, who sat in the passenger seat, staring vacantly at nothing with the glazed expression of someone who had mentally checked out of the situation entirely. "Do you mind staying here for a big? I'm just going to run inside," Milton said, his verbal typo hanging awkwardly in the air between them. He fidgeted with his keys, not making eye contact. Darwin stared out the window with the focused intensity of someone who had discovered a fascinating new world in the mundane scene of a CVS parking lot. A woman struggled with 3 tote bags while trying to wrangle a small child who appeared to be auditioning for an Olympic gymnastics team. "Sure thing, Mill," Darwin replied with a casualness that seemed forced. His fingers drummed a nervous pattern on his knee. Milton nodded, a quick, jerky movement that looked more nervous than acknowledgement, and exited the car. He slammed the door with slightly more force than necessary, as if physically punctuating the end of their conversation. As Milton's figure receded toward the automatic doors of the CVS, Darwin's expression darkened. "If he thinks he can take some small pill to get rid of me, he has another thing coming," Darwin muttered to the empty car, his voice carrying the mixture of indignation and hurt that comes from discovering you're considered a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued. Through some inexplicable shift, the kind that wouldn't even be acknowledged as strange in a dream, Darwin now sat in the back seat behind the driver's seat. He leaned forward, addressing his previous position as if there were still someone sitting there. And suddenly, impossibly, there was. "That's right. He can't get rid of us," Darwin said to Darwin in the passenger seat, who maintained the exact same position and expression as before, as if he hadn't noticed he was now being duplicated throughout the vehicle. Another Darwin materialized in the back next to the first backseat Darwin, appearing with the casual suddenness of someone who had been there all along. This Darwin wore the same clothes as the others, but had his hair slightly more mussed, as if he represented the more disheveled aspects of Darwin's personality. "We have to think of a plan," this new Darwin declared with the authoritative tone of someone who had appointed himself chairperson of a meeting no one had agreed to attend. A fourth Darwin appeared in the driver's seat, materializing with the smooth confidence of someone who believed they belonged at the wheel. He adjusted the rearview mirror with practiced precision, though there was nothing important to see behind them, just more of the CVS parking lot, and a teenager half-heartedly collecting shopping carts while clearly contemplating their life choices. "I know just what to do. We have to make him want to keep us around," driver's seat Darwin announced, his hands positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel despite the car being parked. The Darwin sitting behind the driver's seat made a funny face, the kind of exaggerated expression that suggested he'd learned about human emotions from watching cartoon characters. His eyebrows shot up so high they threatened to leave his forehead entirely, while his mouth contorted into a shape that geometry had no name for. "How are we going to do that?" "He ignores us quite a bit," he asked, his tone suggesting genuine concern beneath the comical expression. The Darwin who sat behind the passenger seat leaned forward, interjecting with the eager energy of someone who had been waiting for their turn to speak at a boring meeting. "We need to get his attention," he said, tapping the back of the passenger seat for emphasis, though passenger seat Darwin didn't react, continuing to stare out the window as if the conversation happening around him was in a foreign language he didn't understand. We have a lot of work to do. We must be everywhere at all times, passenger seat Darwin finally spoke, his gaze never leaving the window, his voice carrying the ominous weight of someone announcing the beginning of a revolution that only they fully understood. Through the windshield, Milton could be seen at the pharmacy counter inside the CVS, his body language suggesting discomfort as the pharmacist explained something to him with excessive hand gestures. The conversation appeared to be about something more complicated than a simple prescription pickup, and Milton's shoulders slumped forward with each passing moment, as if the weight of the world was physically pressing him down. Meanwhile, the car had become a bizarre Darwin convention, each version representing a different facet of the same person, all of them plotting against the one person who didn't seem to want them around, the one person whose opinion apparently mattered most. Milton stood behind a monitor in the warehouse movie set, with the uncomfortable posture of someone who had been standing too long but was too invested in what they were watching to find a chair. He clutched the script in his hand, the pages crumpled at the edges from excessive handling. His knuckles were white, suggesting either deep concentration or the early stages of a hand cramp, possibly both. The warehouse movie set buzzed with the controlled chaos that film productions always seem to generate. A PA scurried by with 6 coffees precariously balanced in a cardboard carrier, looking like they were one sneeze away from disaster. A makeup artist hovered at the edge of the set, clutching a powder brush, her eyes scanning for any hint of unwanted shine on an actor's forehead. Milton's attention, however, was fixed entirely on the monitor, watching the scene unfold with the intense focus of a jeweler examining a suspicious diamond. On screen, Spencer Jones was delivering a performance that would either be described as subtle emotional depth or just kind of sitting there, depending on who was reviewing it. The hospital room on the screen had that quality of places designed to be simultaneously sterile and comforting and failing at both. Muted sunlight struggled through blinds. Various machines beeped softly in the background, their electronic symphony the soundtrack to human frailty. The air had the heavy, stagnant quality that only comes from rooms where time seems to move differently than in the outside world. Spencer sat in a hard plastic chair that appeared to have been specifically engineered to be uncomfortable after exactly 7 minutes of sitting. He looked noticeably smaller than usual, as if the hospital environment had physically shrunk him. Gone was his usual flair, that quality he brought to a room that screamed, "I'm the most interesting person here and I know it." Instead, he seemed almost ordinary, vulnerable in a way that was either genuine character development or really good acting. The line was too blurry to tell. His jacket was folded over his lap with the careful precision of someone who cares too much about designer clothing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, holding his grandmother's frail hand. His expression carried that mix of concern, discomfort, and the distinct look of someone mentally calculating how long they needed to stay before it was socially acceptable to leave. In the bed lay Grandma, early 90s, with the kind of thinness that comes from age slowly whittling away at a person. She had the frail appearance of someone who might blow away in a strong breeze, but her eyes, clear and watchful, betrayed a mind still sharp as a tack. An oxygen cannula rested under her nose, and an IV was taped to her arm, the medical equivalent of tree props holding up an ancient but still magnificent oak. Spencer held her hand with the gentle caution of someone handling a rare butterfly. "You doing okay, Grandma?" he asked, his voice carrying that tone people use in hospitals, slightly too soft, slightly too high, as if volume might somehow affect mortality. "I'm still breathing, ain't I?" "Don't waste your time asking the obvious," Grandma retorted with the kind of bluntness that only comes with reaching an age where you've officially run out of patience for social niceties. Spencer chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that acknowledges humor while simultaneously trying not to disturb the sacred quiet of a hospital room. "You've always had the best bedside manner," he said, his tone suggesting this was a long-running dynamic between them, her caustic honesty, his gentle ribbing. "Better than that nurse who talks to me like I'm 5. If she calls me sweetie one more time, I'm gonna throw this IV pole at her," Grandma threatened with the conviction of someone who had absolutely reached the make good on threat stage of life. Spencer smiled, but his attention began to wander. His gaze drifted toward the window where trees swayed in a breeze that seemed to belong to another world entirely, one where people weren't confined to hospital beds and uncomfortable plastic chairs. "You're drifting again," Grandma observed with the precision of someone who had been watching this human for decades. Spencer snapped back to attention. "What?" he asked before quickly adding after a beat, "No, I'm here." His denial had all the conviction of someone claiming they weren't asleep during a meeting despite the drool still wet on their chin. "You get that look, like your mind's off. Half of you is here, the other half is somewhere else," Grandma said, her observation cutting through his pretense. "Guess that's just how I'm wired," Spencer replied with the practiced deflection of someone who had been having this exact conversation their entire life. "You miss too much when you live up in your head," Grandma countered before adding after a meaningful pause, "Sometimes you've got to stop protecting the future and sit in the now." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of accumulated wisdom. After a long beat that contained multitudes, Spencer exhaled, his body visibly softening. The change was subtle but profound, a physical manifestation of emotional surrender. "I'm here now. You're here now. Be here," Grandma continued, her words simple but landing with the impact of a gentle meteor. Spencer nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat with the distinct motion of someone trying very hard not to cry in public. "Okay, I'm here," he agreed, his voice carrying a new quality, a presence that hadn't been there before. She watched him for a long moment, her gaze seeming to penetrate layers of carefully constructed persona. Her hand squeezed his with surprising strength for someone so frail. "You look tired. Rest," she said, her tone shifting from philosopher to grandmother in an instant. Spencer's face registered the beginning of a protest, but she silenced him with a look that had probably been effective since he was in diapers. "Close your eyes, just for a minute. I'll still be here," she added softly, her voice carrying the tenderness that grandmother seemed to have patented. He leaned back in the chair, his hand still holding hers. "Okay, just a minute," he conceded, his eyes closing with the reluctance of someone who fears what they might miss. The hum of the machines continued their electronic lullaby, and her thumb brushed gently over his knuckles in a rhythm as old as time itself. The screen held for a moment in perfect stillness and quiet, a rare pocket of genuine emotion in the manufactured world of television drama. Cut back to the set. The real world of the film set came rushing back. Darwin, in a complete non sequitur to the emotional scene that had just unfolded, walked behind the monitor wearing a spacesuit that looked like it had been purchased from the discount rack at a Halloween store 3 days after Halloween. The helmet was slightly too large for his head, giving him the appearance of a bobblehead doll, and the suit itself had suspicious stains that suggested it had seen more frat parties than space missions. Milton continued reading the script as the scene played out, his eyes scanning the page with the intensity of someone looking for typos in their already published novel. He glanced up and did a double take at Darwin that would have made cartoon characters proud. His head moved forward and back with such speed it momentarily blurred. His expression transformed from concentration to utter bewilderment, as if his brain was struggling to process the visual non sequitur of a discount astronaut wandering through a hospital drama set. Darwin made swooshing sounds as he walked past Milton, his arms extended outward. The spacesuit crinkled with each movement, sounding less high-tech and more like a plastic grocery bag. "Pew pew," Darwin sound effected with all the maturity of a 5-year-old. "Permission to orbit the ego of a screenwriter, Captain?" His voice was slightly muffled by the helmet, giving his already ridiculous request an additional layer of absurdity. Milton glanced up from his script with the weariness of someone who had long ago accepted that their life would include these kinds of interruptions. He shook his head, not an emphatic refusal, but rather the resigned gesture of someone who had given up fighting the brand of chaos that Darwin represented. Around them, the crew continued working as if a man in a bargain bin spacesuit wasn't walking through their serious hospital drama, a testament to either their professionalism or the frequency with which Darwin pulled these kinds of stunts. Moments later, Darwin adjusted his ridiculous white paper soda jerk hat for the 3rd time in as many minutes. He'd spent 20 minutes that morning getting the fold just right, and now it kept sliding to the left. The red bow tie, clearly from a costume shop clearance bin, hung slightly askew around his neck, complementing the striped apron that had seen better days, possibly in the actual 1950s. He positioned himself behind the catering table with the practiced stance of someone who had watched too many old movies, transforming the mundane setup into his imaginary soda fountain. The chrome coffee dispensers gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and Darwin ran his finger along the edge of the table, as if it were his personal domain. Milton approached the table with the enthusiasm of someone heading to a tax audit. His face moved robotically toward the coffee station. His brown suit hung on his frame, and his posture screamed of a man who had given up on life somewhere around Tuesday of last week. Darwin perked up immediately. "Hey, a slick. What'll it be? Java, jitter juice, or you just jiving?" Darwin's voice carried the forced enthusiasm of a man desperately trying to connect with another human being. Milton just blinked. His face remained so expressionless. The awkward silence stretched between them. Darwin, undeterred by the social cue, pressed on. "Come on, Daddy-O. You look like you need a cool splash of pep. This job's got you more wound up." Milton's expression never changed. Not a muscle moved, not an eyebrow raised. With the mechanical precision of someone performing a task thousands of times, he grabbed a coffee silently. The sound of liquid hitting styrofoam punctuated the uncomfortable silence. Darwin, still committed to his bit, tipped an imaginary hat. "Later, alligator." Milton walked away without a backward glance, leaving Darwin alone with his props and his delusions. The rejection hung in the air. The suburban sidewalk stretched out. Not a particularly clean or new carpet. A gust of wind, as if on cue, sent a small parade of trash tumbling past a lamppost, a potato chip bag, a crumpled receipt, and what might have been a fast food napkin performing an interpretive dance across the concrete. Darwin stood next to the lamppost, still partially dressed in his 1950s Shake Shop attire. The hat was gone, but the bow tie hung limply around his neck, and the striped apron was now folded over his arm. His focus was entirely on a freshly stapled flyer that clung to the wooden pole. The paper, slightly wrinkled from being carried in his pocket, read, "Need a friend? Invisible, loyal, low maintenance, accepting new imaginations, no phone required, just believe." Darwin smoothed the paper against the pole for the fourth time, making sure it was perfectly straight. His fingers lingered on the edges, pressing down with the care of someone handling a rare butterfly. "Gotta market the product," he muttered to himself, his voice carrying no further than the 6 inches between his mouth and the pole. Man can't live on rejection alone. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and grabbed a stack of flyers from his messenger bag. The bag itself had seen better days, frayed at the edges with mysterious stains that told stories of spilled coffee and rain-soaked bus rides. With determined strides, he headed down the sidewalk, a man on a mission. His posture improved with each step. Darwin moved through the neighborhood, a one-man marketing department for an invisible product. He meticulously posted his flyers on a bulletin board at a laundromat, where his notice found itself nestled between guitar lessons from Dave and room for rent, no smokers, no pets, no cooking smells, no loud breathing. A corkboard inside a hipster coffee shop, where baristas with more tattoos than customers gave him side-eye as he carefully positioned his flyer between advertisements for poetry slams and vegan food trucks. The windshield of a parked car, a Honda Civic that had clearly given up on life. Darwin placed the flyer under the wiper with the gentleness of someone leaving a love note, then quickly walked away, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be chased. A tree. The flyer fluttered in the breeze, threatening to tear itself free from the single staple holding it in place. Darwin stood back, admiring his work with hands on his hips. The public library smelled of dust, forgotten dreams, and the faint lemony scent of industrial cleaner. Sunlight filtered through high windows, creating diagonal beams that highlighted the dancing dust particles. The quiet was so absolute that Darwin's footsteps, despite his best efforts at stealth, echoed. Darwin tiptoed past the librarian, a woman whose glasses seemed to be held up by the sheer force of her disapproving stare. She tracked his movement. Her fingers hovered over the desk, ready to shush at a moment's notice. With the calculated movements of a cat burglar, Darwin made his way to the self-help section. Books with titles promising transformation, enlightenment, and overnight success lined the shelves in neat, judgmental rows. Darwin began the delicate operation of slipping flyers into selected books. One landed between Coping with Loneliness and Unlocking Your Inner Child, the white paper peeking out. "What you need, world, is a little imaginary intervention," Darwin whispered, his words barely disturbing the sacred silence of the library. A smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that appears when you've convinced yourself you're doing good work. But it quickly began to melt away, leaving only a sticky residue of reality behind. Later that evening, the park bench had seen better decades. Its green paint was chipped and faded, revealing the weathered wood beneath. Darwin slumped down, his body conforming to the contours worn by countless others before him. Across the park, a little boy with wild curls and light-up sneakers giggled uncontrollably. He hopped from one foot to the other, arms waving in animated conversation with absolutely no one. The boy's imagination painted invisible companions that only he could see, his face alive with the pure joy of make-believe. Darwin watched, hopeful. His eyes lit up and he leaned forward on the bench, hands pressed between his knees. The universal posture of anticipation. But then, as if to personally insult Darwin's entire existence, the boy ran to his real dad, a man in cargo shorts reading something on his phone. The child jumped into his father's arms, dispelling any notion that he'd been playing with an invisible friend. "Even the new generation's not hiring," Darwin sighed, his shoulders slumping. He opened his satchel and flipped through the leftover flyers. The afternoon sun caught them as they moved, their edges worn and corners bent from being handled all day. They fluttered in the breeze, each one representing a connection not made, a job not secured. "Maybe I should have added a QR code," Darwin mused, his tone conveying the existential crisis of a man who had just realized he might be as obsolete as a rotary phone. Darwin leaned back, his neck stretching until he was looking directly up at the vast blue sky. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between wonder and defeat. The coffee shop buzzed with the white noise of modern existence, espresso machines hissing, laptop keys clicking, and the background murmur of conversations no one was really having. A woman sat alone at a small table by the window, typing with the fury of someone trying to murder her keyboard. Her headphones formed a protective force field around her, broadcasting to the world. "Do not approach unless you're bringing me more caffeine." Stress radiated from her, her eyebrows drawn together in permanent concentration. Darwin, with the confidence of someone who couldn't be seen, slid into the seat across from her. The chair made a scraping noise against the floor, but in the cacophony of the coffee shop, it registered as just another ambient sound. "Hey, what we looking at?" Darwin leaned forward, invading personal space that, to him, didn't exist. Darwin's eyes flicked to her screen, scanning lines of text that could have been a novel, a dissertation, or an elaborate grocery list. His head tilted. "That's right, you tell him," he encouraged, nodding sagely as if he understood every nuance of her written battle. She didn't flinch. Not even a micro-expression crossed her face to acknowledge his presence. She remained in her bubble, fingers flying across the keyboard. Darwin, making himself completely at home in her space, reached across and picked up a biscotti from her plate. With the casual entitlement of the invisible, he took a bite. Crumbs fell onto the table, creating a small mess that would later confuse her. "Oh yeah, this relationship is real nourishing," he commented between chews, apparently satisfied with their one-sided interaction. Suddenly the woman's face contorted, her eyes squeezed shut, and she sneezed, a violent explosion that momentarily broke her concentration. "Bless you," Darwin offered, his tone gentle and sincere. But his blessing, like his presence, went unacknowledged as she wiped her nose with a napkin and returned to her typing, never knowing she just shared a moment with someone who wasn't there. The dog park was alive with the sounds of barking, the jingle of collars, and the constant encouragement of owners telling their dogs they were good boys and good girls, despite clear evidence to the contrary. A man in his 30s wearing a North Face jacket that had never seen a mountain and running shoes that had never run, threw a tennis ball for his golden retriever. The dog, a bundle of energy and fur, bounded after it with the single-minded focus of an athlete going for Olympic gold. Darwin, seeing an opportunity for connection, even if it was with a creature that couldn't see him, jogged beside the dog. His legs pumped in exaggerated motions mimicking the sprint of his four-legged companion. "I'm your golden retriever's imaginary friend," Darwin announced to the oblivious owner, his voice carrying across the park. "My name's Bark Ruffalo." The dog suddenly veered off course, abandoning the tennis ball to bark enthusiastically in Darwin's direction. Its tail wagged, and it jumped around in circles, nose pointed directly at the space Darwin occupied. The man scratched his head, creating temporary canyons in his perfectly styled hair. His face contorted into a mask of confusion as he watched his normally predictable pet act completely out of character. "What's gotten into you?" he called out, looking around for whatever might be causing this unusual behavior. Darwin froze mid-fetch, one foot still raised in the air. His eyes widened with a mixture of shock and tentative hope. "Just trying out for the part of sidekick," Darwin explained to no one who could hear him, a wistful note creeping into his voice. The golden retriever continued to bark, its eyes fixed on Darwin with an intensity that suggested it saw something its human couldn't. For a moment, in the dog's eyes at least, Darwin existed. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store buzzed overhead. The sound was just irritating enough to remind everyone shopping that they were, in fact, in a place no one enjoyed being. The polished linoleum floor reflected those lights with a sickly gleam, occasionally interrupted by suspicious sticky spots that had survived multiple half-hearted moppings. Darwin trailed behind a woman pushing a shopping cart with one squeaky wheel that seemed determined to turn every aisle journey into an audio nightmare. The woman, mid-30s, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, methodically checked items off her shopping list with the precision of someone disarming a bomb. Darwin, animated with the enthusiasm of a child in a toy store, began plucking items from shelves and depositing them into her cart. A family-sized box of sugary cereal decorated with a cartoon character that hadn't been relevant since 2005. A bag of potato chips with a flavor profile that could only be described as laboratory accident. A jar of marshmallow fluff that had no practical culinary purpose except to make dentists wealthy. "Let's get these and these and these," Darwin announced, his voice carrying a tone of authority completely disconnected from the reality of his invisible status. He paused, holding up a package of cookies. "I love these," he declared with the conviction of someone who just found the Holy Grail on clearance. The woman, oblivious to her invisible shopping companion, continued down the aisle until she reached the frozen food section. The wall of freezers hummed in unison, their glass doors fogged with condensation from countless openings and closings. She stopped at the frozen peas, her cart coming to rest with a final definitive squeak. She stared at the bags of frozen green spheres with an inexplicable intensity. A slight shiver ran through her body, whether from the cold emanating from the open freezer or some deep-seated pea-related trauma, it wasn't clear. Darwin hovered beside her ear, his mouth uncomfortably close to her personal space, and whispered with the melodramatic disgust of a food critic at a fast food restaurant. "No, not the peas, you, never the peas, yuck." The woman shuddered visibly as if a ghost had just walked through her, which in a way one had. Her hand, which had been reaching for the frozen vegetables, retracted. With renewed purpose and slightly wider eyes, she hurried away from the frozen peas, pushing her cart with newfound determination. Darwin remained behind, sighing with the weight of someone who's just performed a public service, but received no recognition. He glanced up at the black dome of the security camera mounted on the ceiling, its unblinking eye recording everything and nothing at the same time. With the casualness of a child doing something they shouldn't, Darwin waved at the camera, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The gesture of someone who knows they're not on film but can't help testing the boundaries of their invisibility. Near the bus stop, the sun hung low in the sky, painting the world in shades of amber and gold that even the grimy bus stop couldn't make ugly. The metal bench, covered in years of graffiti declarations of love, hate, and anatomically improbable suggestions, gleamed dully in the fading light. Darwin slouched on the bench with the posture of a man who had just watched his lottery numbers come up, one number off on every selection. His shoulders curved inward, creating a C shape of pure defeat. The stack of flyers that had given him purpose and direction earlier in the day was now conspicuously absent. His attempts at connection, the soda jerk routine, the flyers, the whispers in the grocery store had all amounted to nothing. The weight of constant failure seemed to physically press him into the bench, as if gravity worked differently on the perpetually ignored. A man in a business suit that had seen better days walked by, his tie loosened around his neck. For a moment, so brief it could have been imagined, his eyes flicked toward Darwin, then away, focusing back on the cracked sidewalk ahead. Darwin perked up instantly, his spine straightened, his eyes widened, and the faintest hint of a smile began to form at the corners of his mouth. "Can you see me?" Darwin asked, his voice a mixture of hope and disbelief. The man continued walking, his footsteps maintaining their steady rhythm on the concrete, neither speeding up nor slowing down. If he heard anything, he gave no indication. The moment of potential connection evaporated. "Can anyone see me?" Darwin asked, this time directing the question to the universe at large, his voice smaller now. He looked down at the ground, where a crack in the pavement created a jagged line that seemed to perfectly symbolize his fractured existence. A candy wrapper tumbled by, pushed by the same wind that ruffled his hair but couldn't confirm his presence to others. "Didn't think so," he said, the words coming out soft and sad. The final rays of sunlight stretched across the street, but Darwin didn't look up to appreciate the view. His head remained bowed, as if the effort to raise it against the weight of his reality was simply too much to bear. The studio parking lot baked under the midday sun, the asphalt radiating heat. Cars gleamed in neat rows, their metal surfaces almost too hot to touch. The warehouse-style building loomed in the background, its utilitarian design screaming, "Creativity happens here, but we don't want to pay for aesthetics." Milton pushed through the heavy metal door of the warehouse, emerging into the sunlight with the squinted eyes of someone who's been under fluorescent lighting for too many hours. Script pages were tucked under his arm, their edges already curling in the heat. His shoulders slumped with the exhaustion of a man who had spent the day pretending to care about camera angles and character motivations. Darwin trailed behind him, his feet hitting the pavement in quick, agitated steps. His hands gesticulated wildly as he paced alongside Milton, his face contorted with the rage of someone who's been holding it in far too long. "You've been ignoring me all week, Mill. All week," Darwin fumed, his voice rising with each word. "You didn't even say anything when I staged the fake funeral with the squirrels." Milton continued walking, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but his lips moved almost imperceptibly. "Not now, Darwin," he muttered under his breath, the words barely audible. Darwin stepped directly into Milton's path, forcing him to either stop or walk through him, a choice that seemed to physically pain Milton as he came to an abrupt halt. "No now," Darwin insisted, his finger pointing accusingly at Milton's chest. "You don't get to just erase me. You think just because you've got a girlfriend and a show you can graduate from me?" Milton's eyes darted around the parking lot, checking to see if anyone was watching this one-sided confrontation, his face flushed with the embarrassment reserved for people caught talking to themselves in public. "Darwin, stop," Milton hissed, his voice lowered to an urgent whisper. People were indeed watching. A crew member with a coffee cup paused mid-stride, observing Milton with the fascinated horror of someone witnessing a minor car accident. The coffee in his cup sloshed precariously close to the rim as he stood frozen, unsure whether to proceed or retreat. "What? Embarrassed?" Darwin pressed, leaning closer to Milton's face. "Ashamed of your imaginary past?" Milton's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching along his temple. His eyes, darting between Darwin and the onlookers, held the panicked look of a cornered animal. People can see me, Darwin, Milton said through clenched teeth. They can't see you. Darwin threw his hands up, his face a mask of exaggerated incredulity. Good! Let them see you yelling at air, he shouted, no longer caring about Milton's discomfort. Maybe that's what it'll take for you to feel something. Milton attempted to sidestep Darwin, increasing his pace toward a sensible sedan that looked like it had been chosen specifically to avoid drawing attention. Darwin, with the nimbleness of thought rather than physical form, blocked his path again. You know what? Maybe I should just leave, Darwin challenged, his voice cracking slightly beneath the bravado. Maybe that's what you want. Milton stood still for a moment, the parking lot suddenly silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the buzz of insects. His response when it came was quiet but devastatingly clear. Maybe it is. Darwin's mouth dropped open in amazement as if he'd been physically slapped. For once he had no immediate comeback. The hurt in his eyes was raw and unfiltered. Milton used the moment of shocked silence to unlock his car, the electronic beep cutting through the tension. He pulled open the door, creating a barrier between himself and his invisible tormentor. You said it yourself, Darwin, Milton added, his voice steady now. I have everything now. Darwin recovered his voice, though it carried a new weight of realization. No, you have everyone now, he corrected, his tone more sad than angry. But you forgot who got you here. Milton paused with one foot in the car, his back to Darwin. For a moment, it seemed like he might turn around, might acknowledge the truth in those words. But he remained facing forward, frozen in the liminal space between going and staying. You know what? Don't worry, Darwin said, his voice quieter now. I'll pack light. With that, Darwin turned and walked in the opposite direction, his steps measured and deliberate. Milton finally climbed fully into the car and closed the door behind him. He sat in silence, the key in the ignition but the engine still quiet. Almost involuntarily, he glanced into the rearview mirror, but Darwin had already disappeared, as if he'd never been there at all. The network office lobby had been transformed from his daytime corporate sterility into a space of calculated celebration. Track lighting cast a warm glow over the proceedings, strategically hiding the water stains on the ceiling tiles and the worn patches in the carpet. A crowd of well-dressed executives, producers, and crew members mingled around a spread of food that had clearly been chosen more for its visual appeal than its taste. Champagne glasses clinked together in toasts, the alcohol already loosening ties and laughs. A banner hung across one wall, its professionally printed letters proclaiming, "Congratulations, Milton. Spencer Jones, Season 1 Wrap Party." Milton stood awkwardly by the hors d'oeuvres table, picking up and putting down the same mini quiche for the third time. His blazer and sneakers combination, an attempt to look both professional and creative, made him appear like he'd gotten dressed in 2 different decades. He smiled whenever someone looked his way, but it was the tired kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Across the room, Darwin stood off to the side, a spectral gatecrasher at a party celebrating a success he felt partially responsible for. His dress shirt was wrinkled in a way that suggested it had been pulled from the bottom of a laundry pile, and his tie hung loosely knotted around his neck. Under the bright party lights, there was something different about him, a slight transparency, as if he was fading from view in direct proportion to Milton's rising fame. Later that day at the office, the party had reached that perfect equilibrium where everyone was relaxed but not yet embarrassing themselves. Martha, a network executive whose power suit cost more than most people's monthly rent, stood in the center of the room holding a flute of champagne. With practiced authority, she tapped a spoon against her glass, the crystal ping cutting through the ambient chatter. "Can I get everyone's attention for a second?" she called out, her voice carrying the polite but firm tone of someone used to being listened to. The room gradually quieted as heads turned toward her. Milton stood off to the side, trying to look comfortable with being the center of attention and failing spectacularly. Darwin lingered near a fake ficus plant in the corner, absently running his fingers through the plastic leaves that didn't move at his touch. "I just want to say what a joy it's been watching this show come to life," Martha continued, her smile professional but genuine. "And none of it would have happened without this man right here." She gestured dramatically toward Milton with her champagne glass, nearly sloshing the contents onto the carpet. A round of applause erupted, complete with a few enthusiastic whoops from the more inebriated guests. Milton forced a smile, nodding acknowledgments to the room. "And we've got one more surprise." Martha paused for effect, twirling her glass in a small circular motion that threatened to create another carpet-cleaning bill. "The network's moving forward with a premiere screening for the season finale. Big theater, press red carpet, the works." The room erupted in even louder applause and cheers. People patted Milton on the back with varying degrees of force, some clearly trying to physically attach themselves to his success. In his corner, Darwin's face darkened. "Red carpet," he muttered to himself, the words dripping with sarcasm. "Of course. Just roll it right over me, why don't you?" Martha crossed the room to embrace Milton in a hug that managed to be both professional and maternal at the same time. His arms came up robotically to return the gesture, his eyes briefly scanning the room over her shoulder until they landed on Darwin. From his isolated position, Darwin watched the celebration unfold. "This was supposed to be our win," he said quietly, the words lost in the ambient noise of clinking glasses and congratulatory chatter. As the party continued around him, Darwin began a slow, purposeful walk through the crowd. People shifted and moved, unconsciously making way for him despite not seeing him. It was as if some primal instinct sensed his presence, even as their conscious minds remained oblivious. He came to a stop beside a large promotional poster for Spencer Jones. The image showed a stylized version of the show's logo, with Milton's name printed in bold typography across the top. Darwin stared at it for a long moment, then slowly pressed his hand against the glossy paper as if trying to connect with the physical manifestation of what had come between them. "I was here before all of this," he said softly, his voice barely audible even to himself. Across the room, a string quartet that the network had hired to add a touch of class to the proceedings began to play. The gentle notes of violins floated through the air, creating a soundtrack to Darwin's isolation. Milton, surrounded by well-wishers and industry connections, looked up from his conversation. For a moment, his eyes met Darwin's across the crowded room. Something passed between them, recognition, regret, resolve. It was impossible to tell which. But instead of excusing himself to cross the room, he turned deliberately back to the executive he was speaking with, his body language clearly indicating that he had made a choice. Darwin nodded to himself, a small, sad movement of acceptance. "Fine," his inner voice echoed in his head. "You want space? I'll give you space." With the quiet dignity of someone who finally understands when they're not wanted, Darwin turned and walked toward the exit. Unlike his dramatic confrontation in the parking lot, this departure carried the weight of finality. Each step took him further from Milton, further from the relationship that had defined them both, and toward an uncertain future alone. At night in Milton's apartment existed in that depressing middle ground between just moved in and actually decorated, the hallmark of a man who had the financial means to make the place nice but lacked either the time or the inclination to do so. The walls were a rental unit beige that somehow managed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A single framed movie poster, perfectly centered on the living room wall, stood out as the sole evidence that a human with preferences lived there. The apartment was dimly lit, with most of the illumination coming from a small desk lamp and the harsh blue glow of a laptop screen. The only sound penetrating the thick silence was the soft hum of Milton's keyboard as his fingers danced across it with the intensity of someone trying to type their way out of their own thoughts. Milton hunched over the dining table, a purchase from a Swedish furniture store that had required 3 hours and 2 near breakdowns to assemble. His headphones created a barrier between him and the world, the thick padding making his head look smaller by comparison. A mug of coffee sat beside him, the liquid inside having reached that perfect temperature where it was no longer hot but not yet disgusting. In the background, Darwin moved with an uncharacteristic quietness. Gone was the bombastic, attention-seeking, invisible friend who demanded to be acknowledged. This Darwin was subdued, deflated. He quietly zipped a small imaginary duffel bag that somehow seemed more real than he did in that moment. His white shirt hung untucked around his frame, and his glasses were off, revealing eyes that looked tired from seeing too much. There were no wisecracks, no antics, just the methodical movements of someone packing to leave. He walked to the bookshelf, a mismatched collection of actual books Milton had been meaning to read and random objects that had accumulated over the years. Darwin paused at a small action figure perched on the top shelf, a cartoonish version of himself with exaggerated features and a permanent grin. With delicate care, he lifted it and gently placed it on the couch. A goodbye gift, a reminder, a relic. Milton didn't look up from his screen, the glow casting his face in a sickly pallor that made him look both younger and more tired at the same time. "You're busy, I get it," Darwin said softly, his voice barely carrying across the room. Milton continued typing, his fingers striking the keys with a rhythm that didn't falter. Whatever world he was creating on that screen had completely consumed him, leaving no attention for the one disappearing behind him. "I thought maybe you'd say something. You know," Darwin continued, a hint of hope still clinging to his words. "Where you going, Dar? Or, come on, don't be like that." Milton kept typing, the click-clack of the keyboard providing an unintentional percussion track to Darwin's farewell speech. The sound filled the apartment, constant and unfeeling. "But I guess you already did," Darwin concluded, his voice trailing off into the air. With a resigned sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs, Darwin slung the bag over his shoulder and stood by the door. He took a last look around the apartment, at the furniture they'd picked out together, though Milton had paid, at the kitchen where Darwin had tried countless times to cook and failed, at the couch where they'd watched movies, with Darwin providing unsolicited commentary. And then, almost imperceptibly, he began to fade, just slightly. His edges became less defined, his colors less vibrant. Not enough to disappear, but enough to notice if you were looking. "I'll be around, just not in the way I used to be," Darwin said, the words hanging in the air. Still nothing from Milton. His fingers continued their relentless dance across the keyboard, his eyes never leaving the screen, his expression never changing. Darwin reached for the doorknob, his fading hand contacting the metal in a way that defied the laws of physics, solid yet not, there yet not. He turned it and pulled the door open, the hinges creaking slightly in the quiet apartment. A faint breeze, real or imagined, drifted through the open doorway, lifting some loose script pages on the table next to Milton. They fluttered, then settled back into place. Milton's fingers paused, hovering over the keyboard as if frozen mid-thought. He looked up, blinking as if waking from a dream. But the door was already closing, the soft click of the latch the only evidence that someone had been there at all. The therapist's office existed in a strange liminal space that felt as if it had been designed by someone with access to both Victorian estate sales and IKEA clearance events, with no loyalty to either aesthetic. The walls couldn't decide if they wanted to be burgundy or mauve, so they settled on an uncomfortable middle ground that made the room feel both stuffy and undefined. A fireplace glowed faintly in one corner, the flames more aesthetic than functional, providing just enough warmth to make a sweater unnecessary, but not enough to prevent goosebumps. A lava lamp churned slowly on a side table, its blue and red globs rising and falling with the uncertain rhythm of a procrastinator's motivation. On the bookshelf, alongside leather-bound volumes with imposing titles no one had ever read, sat a stuffed wombat with glass eyes that seemed to follow movement around the room, judging everyone silently with its perpetual expression of mild disapproval. Darwin lay stretched out on a chaise lounge upholstered in fabric that might have once been velvet but now more closely resembled the worn-out fur of an elderly cat. He wore a hoodie and jeans, the universal uniform of someone who had given up trying to impress anyone. His posture was a physical manifestation of defeat, limbs arranged in the way that suggested they might never move again. Across from him, perched in a tall wingback chair that added at least 4 inches to his already considerable height, sat Darwin Freud, a more sophisticated, older-looking version of Darwin himself. His beard was wiry and gray, with the kind of deliberate unkemptness that required significant grooming. He wore tiny round glasses that balanced precariously on his nose, a black waistcoat that had been tailored within an inch of its life, and he smoked a long curved pipe that, curiously, produced no smoke. The overall effect was of someone who had studied photographs of Sigmund Freud and decided to take it all just a bit too far. With exaggerated movements, Darwin Freud scribbled on an invisible notepad with an imaginary pencil, occasionally making thoughtful sounds for no apparent reason other than to remind Darwin of his presence. "I moved out," Darwin announced to the ceiling, his eyes tracing the pattern of water stains that resembled either continents or very sad animals, depending on how you looked at them. "I thought it'd make a statement. Make him realize how much he needs me." Darwin Freud paused his imaginary note-taking, peering over his tiny glasses with the intensity of someone about to deliver profound wisdom. "And did it?" he asked, his voice carrying exactly the same cadence as Darwin's, but pitched slightly lower for gravitas. Darwin continued to stare at the ceiling, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resignation. "Nope, nada, zilch," he replied flatly. "Man's living like I was never even there." Darwin Freud responded, managing to pack an entire therapy session's worth of judgment into a single syllable. "He's got the girl, the job, the dream," Darwin continued, each word carrying the weight of something lost. He paused, the silence filling the room before he added, "And I'm here, talking to myself to you, Doctor." Darwin Freud. Which, let's face it, isn't even new. Darwin Freud tapped his pipe on the armrest of his chair, producing a sound despite the fact that neither the pipe nor the tapping was technically real. "Have you considered," he began, drawing out each word, "you might no longer be necessary?" Darwin jolted upright on the chaise lounge, the sudden movement making the ancient springs protest with a screech. "You're supposed to be helping me, not kicking me in my fragile, non-existent nut," he exclaimed, his voice rising to a pitch. Darwin Freud remained unmoved, his expression one of practiced therapeutic neutrality. "Sometimes the cure stings," he offered with a smug satisfaction. "You're me," Darwin countered, throwing his hands up in exasperation, his fingers spread wide. "Technically, yes," Darwin Freud conceded with a small nod that made his glasses slide a precise millimeter down his nose. "But in this setting, I'm your subconscious therapist. Play along." Darwin rubbed his eyes with the heels of his palms, pressing hard enough to see stars. It was the gesture of someone clearly unraveling. "I'm scared, man," he admitted, the words coming out small and vulnerable. "I keep flickering." Darwin Freud leaned forward in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. His glasses slid further down his nose, but he made no move to push them back up. "When was the last time he looked you in the eye?" he asked, his tone gentler now, the question hitting Darwin. Darwin looked down at his hands, noticing with alarming detachment that he could see the pattern of the chaise lounge through them if he held them at just the right angle. "I don't know. Days? Weeks?" he answered, his voice trailing off before he rallied. "But it's more than that. He's not even acknowledging me." Darwin Freud leaned even further forward, coming dangerously close to toppling out of his chair. His glasses now hung precariously at the very tip of his nose. "What do you think that means?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That he's forgetting me," Darwin replied softly, the words falling from his lips. Darwin Freud smiled then, a warm expression that transformed his face from stern analyst to compassionate friend. It was the first bit of real kindness he'd shown all session, and it was somehow more devastating than his earlier bluntness. "Then the question is," he said, his voice gentle, "what do you want to do with the time you have left?" Darwin turned his gaze to the fireplace, where flames danced behind glass doors. His reflection flickered faintly in the glass, distorted by the moving light. For the first time, he wasn't sure if the wavering image was due to the flames or if he was fading away. The city park after dark had all the charm of an abandoned movie set. familiar elements arranged in recognizable patterns but devoid of the energy that made them meaningful. Cold emptiness hung in the air. The park was dimly lit by flickering lampposts, each one threatening to give up entirely with every sputter. A light rain fell from the sky, not the romantic, cleansing kind from movies, but the miserable drizzle. The droplets caught the intermittent light, creating tiny prisms. Darwin sat alone on a bench. The wood underneath him was covered in declarations of love, anatomically creative insults, and philosophical questions. His hood was pulled up over his head, creating a small cave of fabric that kept the rain off his face but did nothing for his spirits. His arms were crossed tightly across his chest, either for warmth or self-comfort or both. Next to him on the bench sat a cardboard sign that was rapidly losing structural integrity in the damp. In marker that had begun to bleed, it read, "Invisible, unemployed, unimagined." Darwin reached out and adjusted the sign, straightening it with a careful precision. He sighed, the sound lost in the ambient noise of distant traffic and rain hitting leaves. A couple walked by on the path in front of him, their laughter cutting through the gloom. They walked close together, sharing an umbrella and possibly a joke, completely oblivious to the bench and its occupant. As they passed, one of them walked straight through Darwin's outstretched legs. Darwin didn't flinch. This happened too often now to warrant a reaction. With mechanical movements, he reached into a nearby trash can and pulled out an old paper coffee cup. The logo on the side was faded and a lipstick stain marked the rim. He placed it carefully at his feet as if it were a tip jar that mattered. And then, a shopping cart announced its approach with a distinctive clink-clank sound. Darwin looked over his shoulder to see an old man pushing the cart slowly down the path. The man's clothes hung on his frame, which they probably did. His gray beard was unkempt but somehow dignified. He mumbled to himself as he walked, having a conversation that required no outside participation. But behind the old man, something caught Darwin's attention. Following a few steps behind was another faded imaginary figure, a short, round man with wings that seemed too small for his body, and a sash draped over his shoulder that declared, "Best Friend 1997" in faded gold letters. The figure moved with the resigned loyalty. "Damn," Darwin murmured to himself, watching the pair approach. "He's still hanging on." The imaginary figure noticed Darwin as they passed. Their eyes met in the way that only the eyes of two beings who share the same plane of non-existence can. The winged figure nodded with understanding, a small, almost imperceptible movement that acknowledged their shared condition. Darwin nodded back, a moment of solidarity between two entities fading from memory. The old man and his imaginary friend rounded the corner and disappeared, leaving Darwin alone again in the rain. With the slow, deliberate movements, Darwin lay down on the bench, using his hoodie as a makeshift pillow. The wet wood pressed against his back, but he either didn't notice or didn't care. He stared up at the night sky, mostly hidden by clouds but occasionally revealing a star or two through breaks in the cosmic ceiling. "I used to sleep in a treehouse," he mused aloud, his voice barely audible above the sound of the rain. "That was nice." A single drop of rain hit his cheek, rolling down his face. He wiped it away automatically and checked his hand, as if expecting the moisture to have done something to him, stained him, dissolved him, proved he was still somehow physical in this world. He closed his eyes, shutting out the park and the rain and the memories, and for a moment his body flickered, then not, then there again, a glitch, a hiccup in the universe, a preview of what was coming, and no one was there to see it happen. Darwin trudged up the familiar staircase of Milton's apartment building, his hoodie pulled over his head. The duffel bag slung over his shoulder swayed with each step. When he reached Milton's door, he hesitated, standing there. Through the door, he could hear the unmistakable sounds of a party in full swing, laughter that was just a little too loud, music, and the kind of rhythmic applause that suggested someone had just made a toast. Darwin cracked the door open with a tentative motion. The interior of Milton's apartment presented itself as an assault of festivity. The lights were warm in that intentionally dim way that hides the flaws in both the apartment and its occupants' appearances. Balloons and decorations were plastered everywhere with the aggressive cheerfulness. Streamers dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly whenever anyone walked underneath them, occasionally brushing against the tallest guests' heads. A crowd of friends and co-workers mingled throughout the space, each holding drinks and laughing at conversations that weren't funny, all participating in the social contract of pretending to enjoy themselves more than they were. On the big flat-screen TV, which Milton had bought to impress visitors rather than because he needed the extra inches, Victoria appeared via Zoom. She was wearing a red dress. She held up a glass of champagne with the practiced poise. "To Milton, my fiancé, my favorite writer, my partner, and my best friend," Victoria declared from the screen, her voice carrying the rehearsed sincerity. "I can't wait for all the episodes ahead." The crowd erupted in cheers. Milton laughed bashfully and raised his glass. Darwin stepped inside quietly, moving with a careful stealth. He set his bag down just inside the door with a gentle touch. He didn't move, just stood there. From his vantage point, Darwin watched Milton, his once best friend, who was now surrounded by all the trappings of a successful life. People who laughed at his jokes, a beautiful fiancée, and an apartment that didn't have that one weird smell that most apartments develop over time. Milton had the satisfied glow. Milton's arm was draped around a producer's shoulders in that casual way. They were mid-conversation, both smiling with the intensity. Darwin took a few steps deeper into the room, moving. Still, no one noticed him. He looked down at himself as if checking whether he'd accidentally turned invisible on the way over. Then his eyes drifted back up to the screen where Victoria's smile glowed through the speakers, her teeth so perfect. "She's the best friend now," Darwin mouthed quietly, the words barely escaping his lips. His gaze shifted to the action figure on the shelf, his old miniature self. Still there, still smiling. The tiny plastic figure stood as a monument to a friendship that had apparently been relegated to shelf decoration status. Darwin swallowed hard, his throat making that distinctive gulp sound. He picked up his duffel with a resigned movement. He took one last look at Milton from across the room, the distance between them somehow feeling vast despite being only a few feet of hardwood flooring. He wanted to say something. The perfect line that would simultaneously express his hurt, congratulate Milton on his success, and remind him of their friendship. But the words didn't come. Instead, he opened the door and closed it quietly behind him with a careful precision. Now standing in the stairwell, Darwin remained motionless, one hand still on the railing. His shoulders slumped in that universal posture of defeat. He took a breath that seemed to fill his entire body. Then, in a moment that defied both physics and emotional metaphor, he flickered faintly. He descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last, disappearing into shadow. Darwin walked through quiet suburban blocks lit only by scattered streetlights. His hoodie was pulled up over his head. The wind picked up, rustling leaves across the pavement. He walked with no direction, just moving to keep from stopping. As he passed a convenience store, the fluorescent lights inside created that sickly glow. Inside, a man in his 40s was laughing loudly despite being completely alone. He was gesturing wildly, engaged in what appeared to be a spirited conversation with absolutely no one. Darwin stopped, observing this strange scene with the curiosity. The man continued his animated discussion with empty air, seeming genuinely entertained by whatever non-existent companion he was addressing. Then just for a second, Darwin saw it, a blurry outline beside the man, taking the shape of a cowboy in a 10-gallon hat. The image wavered, or reality television footage being censored. Darwin squinted, straining to bring the figure into focus. But as he concentrated, the image flickered, then vanished entirely. Darwin turned and continued his aimless journey, walking away with a determined gait. Later that night, Darwin came upon a playground. A middle-aged man in a suit sat alone on a swing set, slowly swaying back and forth. Or rather, he wasn't completely alone. Sitting in the next swing was a blonde woman in a tutu and boxing gloves, an outfit choice that screamed, "I'm not real," louder than any words could. She was completely out of place. No one else could see her. That much was clear from the casual disinterest of the few people walking past, none of whom seemed concerned about the bizarre boxing ballerina on playground equipment. Darwin watched this odd couple with a curiosity. The man spoke to the woman with the comfortable familiarity of old friends. The woman threw her arms up in an exaggerated gesture of exasperation that nearly sent her flying off the swing. They were engaged in a full-blown argument. "We all turn into reruns eventually, huh?" Darwin chuckled to himself. He continued his nighttime wandering, moving on. Sometime later, Darwin found himself sitting on a park bench. The park around him was still and silent. A light fog crept along the grass. In the distance, a group of 3 grown men sat in a circle, talking with the intense focus. Each had a faint, fuzzy imaginary friend by their side, visible only to Darwin's increasingly disturbed perception. One wore a cape that flapped without wind, one appeared to be a robot with occasional sparks shooting from its joints, and one was, inexplicably, an octopus wearing a chef's hat, its tentacles gesturing wildly during the conversation. Darwin watched this scene unfold with half in disbelief, his expression. The whole tableau looked troubling. One of the imaginary friends, a mime with rainbow suspenders, noticed Darwin watching and waved at him from across the park with the enthusiastic greeting. Darwin didn't wave back. Instead, he lowered his head. He pulled his hood further over his eyes. For the first time in what was presumably his entire existence, he didn't want to be seen. A concerning development for someone whose entire purpose had been to be seen by at least one person. The night grew later, and Darwin found himself sitting on the edge of a tall rooftop, his legs dangling over the side with a casual disregard for safety. Below him, the city pulsed with the frenetic energy of nightlife. Neon signs flickered, distant sirens howled their urgent messages, and lives moved on with the relentless momentum. Darwin stared blankly ahead, his hoodie pulled tight around his face. His duffel bag sat beside him, the contents still a mystery but now taking on the ominous significance. A long silence stretched out, broken only by the ambient noise of the city below. Then footsteps behind him. Not the casual footsteps, but the deliberate footsteps of someone who came looking for him specifically. Darwin didn't turn around. He maintained his 1,000-yard stare with a stubborn dedication. "You always were a bit dramatic," came a voice from behind him, a voice that was unsettlingly familiar. Darwin turned his head slowly, with a reluctant motion. Standing behind him was a clean, glowing version of himself, dressed in all white, barefoot, with a serene expression. His eyes were full of warmth and knowing. "Let me guess. You're here to tell me it's not that bad?" Darwin asked, his tone carrying the weary sarcasm. "Number it is," spiritual Darwin replied with unexpected honesty, pausing for dramatic effect before adding, "But it's not the end, just your part of the story." Darwin exhaled, looking down at the cars far below, tiny as toys from this height. "Feels like I got written out," Darwin said, expressing the unique existential dread. "You were more than that. You were the best part of him." "For a long time," spiritual Darwin responded, delivering the line with a perfect blend of compassion and fortune cookie wisdom. Darwin didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. Spiritual Darwin walked over and sat next to him, mimicking his pose with a synchronized movement. The two identical figures perched on the ledge created an image that was simultaneously profound and ridiculous. "Remember when he couldn't sleep without you next to the bed?" Spiritual Darwin asked, diving into nostalgia. "Yeah," Darwin replied, a small smile breaking through his melancholy. "I used to do voices, even played the monster under the bed once just to keep the real one away." The memory hung in the air between them, a shared experience that somehow belonged to both of them despite one of them being a spiritual manifestation. "You gave him imagination when the world told him to grow up," spiritual Darwin continued, speaking with a cadence. "You gave him courage when no one believed in him. And now he doesn't need you to protect him." "But I still need him," Darwin admitted, his voice carrying the raw honesty. "No," spiritual Darwin countered firmly, pausing for dramatic effect. You need to let go, so he can become the version of himself you always believed in. Darwin's face tightened, holding back tears with the determination. What happens to me, he asked, voicing the fundamental question of anyone facing obsolescence. Spiritual Darwin stood, assuming the posture. You finish your story, he said simply, the words hanging in the air with the weight of inevitability. Darwin looked back out at the horizon where the first hints of dawn were beginning to soften the night sky. But don't forget, you weren't forgotten. You were loved, Spiritual Darwin added, pausing again for maximum impact. And you mattered. A warm gust of wind blew past. Darwin closed his eyes, feeling the breeze against his face. When he opened them, Spiritual Darwin was gone, having disappeared with the convenient timing. Darwin stood, straightened his hoodie with newfound resolve, and smiled, the kind of smile that suggests both acceptance and the beginning of something new. The public bathroom was exactly the kind of place that would make anyone reconsider how badly they needed to use the facilities. The dim lights flickered with the erratic pattern, casting shadows that somehow made everything look dirtier than it already was. The mirrors were stained with rust patterns. This was the kind of bathroom where you'd be more worried about what you might catch from washing your hands than from not washing them. Darwin stood at the sink, staring at his reflection with the intensity. His image was faint, flickering slightly. He had the resigned look. His hoodie lay crumpled on the counter beside him. He exhaled slowly, the kind of deliberate breath people take when they're either trying to calm down or preparing to do something momentous. From a small duffel bag that had seen better days but was still trying its best, he pulled out a series of items with the ceremonial precision. First came a crisp white dress shirt, so pristine it looked like it had never been worn or even exposed to oxygen. It had that department store fold that's impossible to recreate once undone. Next were black suspenders. Then slim-fit dress pants emerged, creased with military precision. Finally, a dark burgundy bow tie appeared. Each item was folded with the meticulous care. The clothing had the pristine quality of artifacts preserved for a museum display titled, "What I Should Have Been Wearing All Along." In the bathroom stall moments later, the ambiance was enhanced by the symphony of preparation, the rustle of fabric, the zip of a bag, and Darwin's soft humming. He was singing to himself. When the stall door finally creaked open with the dramatic timing, Darwin stepped out completely transformed. His hair was slicked back with the precision. His glasses were polished to the point where they might work as emergency mirrors in a pinch. His clothes fit perfectly. He looked ready to make peace with his legacy. He approached the mirror and straightened his bow tie with a focused attention, adjusting it fractionally until it was just right. For a moment, he saw his full reflection, solid, whole, real. He smiled softly. "Let's go out in style," he said to himself, delivering the line with the quiet determination. He lifted his duffel bag, now empty of its precious cargo, and tossed it in the trash with the decisive finality. Then he exited the bathroom, leaving behind the sad fluorescent lighting for whatever awaited him outside. Darwin stepped into the twilight, entering a world painted in the muted blues and purples of early evening. Down the block, the marquee for Spencer Jones' The Cubicle Chronicles glowed with the artificial enthusiasm. The sign featured lettering that was trying way too hard to look creative for what was essentially a show about office life. Theater lights flickered and crowds gathered with the excited buzz. Darwin walked toward them with the posture, tall, composed, ready for whatever awkward social interactions awaited him. The theater lobby was a stark contrast to the grim bathroom where Darwin had transformed himself. It exuded glitz in the way that only places designed to impress managed to achieve, simultaneously trying too hard and somehow succeeding. Flashbulbs popped with the irregular rhythm as photographers captured celebrities and semi-celebrities. A red carpet stretched across the floor. Towering posters for Spencer Jones, The Cubicle Chronicles, dominated the background, showing a comically stressed office worker surrounded by quirky colleagues. In the center of this carefully orchestrated chaos stood Milton, wearing a sleek tux that fit him properly. He was laughing with the network executives. The executives had that distinct look of people who make decisions about what everyone else watches while themselves only streaming documentaries about wine. "This premiere's already buzzing, Milton." "You should be proud," said network exec number 1, a man whose distinguishing characteristic was being slightly taller than network exec number 2. "Thank you, I am," Milton replied with practiced humility. He pulled out his phone with a casual motion. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," Milton said to the executives, his tone suggesting they were about to receive a special privilege rather than just meet someone via FaceTime. He tapped the FaceTime icon and waited through that awkward moment when you're not sure if the other person will pick up and everyone stands around pretending they're not just staring at a loading screen. Victoria appeared on screen, glowing in her living room with the perfect lighting. She wore a cocktail dress that was clearly chosen to be impressive yet comfortable for someone watching from home, formal on top, possibly pajama bottoms off camera. "Hey babe, you look sharp," Victoria said with the enthusiasm. "Say hi to the people making this possible," Milton replied, turning the phone around to show the executives with the proud gesture. The executives waved with the awkward motion. "You've got a keeper, Milton," said exec number 2, delivering the kind of generic compliment. Milton smiled with satisfaction, completely unaware of what was happening over his shoulder. Darwin, now dressed to the nines, watched quietly near the refreshment table. He stood next to a display of champagne flutes. He hesitated with the uncertainty. Then, having made his decision, he approached Milton with a determined stride. Just wanted to say, break a leg," Darwin said, his tone carrying the forced casualness. "Not now, okay?" Milton responded, turning away from his phone with a slight irritation. He patted Darwin's shoulder with a dismissive gesture. Darwin forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He nodded with a resigned acceptance. "Sure, I get it," Darwin said, his words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. Milton immediately returned his attention to the executives, the interaction with Darwin already forgotten. "Yeah, I get it," Darwin said to himself. The phrase hung in the air, present but deliberately ignored by all parties involved. Inside the theater, the curtain call was underway with all the ceremonial grandeur. An usher stepped on stage with a confident stride. He adjusted the microphone with that unnecessary tap people do when they want to seem like they know what they're doing. "Ladies and gentlemen," the usher announced with a practiced enthusiasm, "thank you for joining us tonight. Please take your seats. The final 2 episodes of Spencer Jones, The Cubicle Chronicles, will begin shortly." Applause rippled through the audience with varying degrees of enthusiasm, from the genuine excitement of true fans to the perfunctory clapping of people who were only there because their significant others had dragged them along. People shuffled to find their seats, apologizing profusely as they stepped on toes and knocked over $15 drinks that were 90% ice anyway. Milton was ushered to the front row with the executives, guided to seats that had been protected by reserved signs. The executives arranged themselves in order of importance, a corporate pecking order as rigid as any royal court. Darwin lingered in the back, watching Milton soak in the moment, laughing with that slightly too loud laugh people use when they want others to notice they're having a good time, excited in the way people get when they think their life is finally going the way they always imagined, surrounded by the kind of people who wouldn't have given him the time of day 3 years ago. Darwin stood alone, observing the festivities with a detached interest. In the theater lobby, Darwin remained frozen in place. He could hear the muffled sound of the opening title sequence echoing from the auditorium, that distinctive music that would be stuck in everyone's head for days afterward, but that no one could hum correctly. Then the auditorium erupted with laughter, followed by cheers that suggested something genuinely funny had happened, rather than the forced laughter people give when they know they're supposed to find something amusing. Darwin's chest rose in response. He took a deep breath that filled his lungs with determination and entered the theater. Darwin slipped into the back row, moving stealthily. His eyes locked on the glowing screen with intensity. He watched silently as Spencer's final adventure began to unfold before him. The theater went dark with that special kind of darkness that makes you forget there are other people sitting around you. A hush fell over the crowd, the kind of collective silence that happens when everyone simultaneously decides to stop rustling their candy wrappers. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the faces of the audience with that eerie blue glow. On the screen, a fantasy sequence began in an industrial zone at night, the kind of abandoned warehouse district that only exists in movies and TV shows where the rent is apparently free and villains gather without fear of real estate developers. A high-speed hovercraft skidded into frame dramatically, steam rising from vents in a way that served no practical purpose but looked really cool. Spencer Jones, the show's protagonist, leapt out of the vehicle with dual pistols and a trench coat that flapped in the wind with perfect timing. His jaw was clenched in that way actors do when they want to convey determination without saying anything, and blood decorated his temple in that perfect movie injury way, enough to look dramatic but not enough to suggest actual medical attention was required. Beside him stood his grandma, silvery hair pulled into a tight braid, the kind of hairstyle that suggests both practicality and a hidden badass nature. She wore sunglasses at night because action heroes apparently never need to see clearly, a bulletproof vest that somehow fit her perfectly despite being designed for someone half her age and twice her size, and a rocket launcher slung over her back. She resembled Spencer's grandmother exactly, which was either a massive coincidence or the kind of plot twist that TV writers think is subtle. "We're outnumbered. We need a plan," Spencer said, stating the obvious with grave seriousness. "You run head first. I blow stuff up. That is the plan," Grandma replied with confidence. Spencer nodded, looking respectfully terrified. A shadow army of masked enemies appeared on rooftops, catwalks, and alleyways with synchronized timing. They posed menacingly, making sure to spread themselves out for maximum dramatic effect rather than tactical advantage. Grandma lit a cigar with casual flair, holding it between her teeth. "Cover your ears, baby boy," she instructed. She fired the rocket launcher with absolutely no regard for recoil physics or the structural integrity of the surrounding buildings. Boom! The building exploded behind the goons with perfect timing, raining fire and steel in a way that somehow only affected the bad guys and not the heroes standing 30 feet away. Spencer dived, rolling into cover with gymnastic ability, guns blazing in that special movie way where bullets never run out unless the plot requires it. Grandma flipped through the air with agility, landed on a car that somehow supported her weight without denting, and dual-wielded Uzis while cackling. "Are you even real?" Spencer asked with a grin, somehow finding time for existential questions in the middle of a firefight. "Real enough to keep you alive," Grandma answered cryptically, in the way characters do when they want to hint at a twist without revealing anything. They fought side by side in choreographed chaos. Grandma drove a motorcycle into a helicopter with casual disregard for physics. Spencer ziplined using a grappling hook made from a necktie, demonstrating improvisational skills. They landed in a pile of goons and high-fived with synchronization. Suddenly, time slowed down in that distinctive way that signals either a major plot revelation or the director showing off their new camera equipment. Spencer heard something cocking his head. "Spencer," a mom voice called out, distant and echoing. Spencer looked around with frantic confusion. Grandma continued fighting, unfazed by the disembodied voice, either because she couldn't hear it or because fighting masked goons was simply a higher priority. "Did you hear that?" Spencer asked, the first sign of genuine concern crossing his face. "Hear what?" Grandma replied, continuing to defy the laws of physics and human endurance with every move. Another explosion rocked the scene, this one perfectly timed to punctuate the dialogue. "Spencer, honey, wake up," the mom's voice called again, louder now, with the insistent tone mothers develop after years of trying to get their children out of bed for school. I know you," Spencer said, his face showing dawning realization. "Of course you do," Grandma replied with cryptic smugness. "Spencer, come back to us," the mom's voice demanded, now louder than the explosions, with urgency. Spencer started to step toward Grandma, but she stepped back with perfect timing. "You know who I am, don't you?" Grandma asked, asking the kind of question people only ask when they already know the answer. Spencer squinted, straining to see through what was apparently becoming obvious to everyone in the audience except him. Her face flickered. "Grandma?" he asked, his voice carrying tentative uncertainty. The fantasy sequence began to fade slightly, the colors desaturating, the visual equivalent of reality crashing a very expensive party. Grandma walked toward him with slow, deliberate pace. "I'll always be with you, baby. But this is your fight now," she said, touching his face with gentleness that contrasted sharply with her previous rocket launcher enthusiasm. Light beamed from her hand in that subtle way that indicates either divine intervention or a special effects budget running low. "Spencer," the mom's voice shouted with sharp urgency. "Tell your mom I said hi," Grandma instructed, delivering the kind of line that confirms she's definitely not making it to the sequel. The scene abruptly cut to a hospital room at night, the stark fluorescent lighting a jarring contrast to the explosive fantasy sequence. Spencer bolted upright from a chair beside a hospital bed with sudden motion. His mom, a woman in her late 50s with the worn look of someone who's been in a hospital waiting room for several days, stood over him with teary eyes that suggested whatever news she had wasn't about winning the lottery. "She's gone," Mom said sincerely. Spencer looked at the still figure in the bed, the realization dawning on his face. It was his grandmother, lying peaceful and still in a way living people never quite manage. Her name tag beside her read, Aurora Ray Jones, confirming what the audience had probably figured out 15 minutes ago. "Aurora," Spencer whispered, lowering his head and holding her hand. A tear fell with perfect cinematic timing. Back in the real theater, the credits began to roll, scrolling at that perfect speed that's just fast enough that you can't read all the names but slow enough to make you feel like you should try. The audience was silent, collectively processing what they'd just witnessed with stunned quietness. Then thunderous applause erupted, the kind that starts with one person and quickly spreads. Milton sat among the executives, teary-eyed but proud, with a satisfied expression. People rose to their feet, clapping with enthusiastic vigor. Some whistled with that piercing sound that always makes everyone within 10 feet wince. A few audience members wiped away tears, either genuinely moved or worried their mascara might run. Milton, overwhelmed and proud, turned toward the crowd with a humble smile. Executives, actors, and crew members swarmed him. "Milton, that was incredible," gushed fan number 1. "I'm honored to be part of this," actor number 2 declared. "I told you the grandma twist would slay," executive number 1 said, taking credit for someone else's creative work with confidence. Milton nodded and smiled through the praise, his expression the perfect blend of, "I deserve this," and "I'm so surprised." But his eyes kept scanning the crowd, looking for something or someone specific. At the back of the room, Darwin watched the celebration unfold with detached perspective. He didn't clap. He just smiled with quiet understanding. Their eyes met across the crowded theater in that movie-perfect moment that never actually happens in real life unless you're staring creepily at someone until they notice you. Milton's smile faded, just for a moment, replaced by a look of recognition that carried the weight of years of shared history. He gently pushed through the crowd with determination and walked toward Darwin, moving slow and steady. Darwin took a breath, his chest expanding dramatically. His eyes glossed with emotion. They stopped face to face, close enough to notice the tiny details that only become visible when you're standing in someone's personal space, the slight wrinkle of concern between Milton's eyebrows, the faint flicker around Darwin's edges. A beat of silence passed between them. Milton knew, Darwin knew, they both knew. Milton opened his mouth to speak, but Darwin lifted a finger to silence him. "Don't say anything sad, Mill," Darwin said with a shaky smile. Milton chuckled, holding back tears with strained expression. They hugged, a full, tight, warm embrace that carried the weight of every memory, every laugh, every breakdown they'd shared over the years. Then Darwin stepped back, creating physical distance to match the emotional one that had been growing between them. He smiled with peaceful acceptance and disappeared. Just like that. One moment there, the next gone. Milton stood alone, but he didn't cry. He just breathed in deeply. Sometime later, at a city park on a peaceful day, The sky stretched overhead in that perfect shade of blue that seems artificially enhanced. A light breeze rustled the trees with just enough force to be pleasant without messing up anyone's hair. Dogs barked in the distance, children laughed, the ambient soundtrack of a perfect day in a public space. Milton walked along a gravel path, now dressed casually in a polo short-sleeved shirt that suggested relaxation. Sunglasses shielded his eyes, and he carried a coffee in hand. He looked relaxed, but a bit older and a bit wiser. As he walked, something caught his eye. Up ahead, near a bench that had seen better days, an older man in his early 60s wearing an oversized trench coat was engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument with absolutely no one. The coat hung on his frame, suggesting either significant weight loss or a fundamental misunderstanding of clothing sizes. Milton stopped, watching the scene unfold with curiosity. "I told you already. Stop stealing my raisins," the older man shouted at the empty air beside him, swatting at it. "And don't you look at me like that," he continued after a beat, responding to an expression no one else could see. "You're driving me crazy," he declared with exasperation. After another pause, he added, "Shut up, you," with emphatic finality. Milton didn't judge. He didn't call for help or try to intervene. He just smiled, with quiet understanding of recognizing something familiar in this strange tableau. Memories flickered behind his eyes, snippets of laughter shared over absurd jokes, a food truck adventure that had ended with them both covered in hot sauce, makeshift spacesuits constructed from aluminum foil and cardboard boxes, late-night Twinkie runs when deadlines loomed, all the moments that make up a friendship. Milton smiled a small, sad smile, and acknowledged something precious has been lost but appreciates that it existed at all. He kept walking, leaving the older man to continue his one-sided argument. The wind picked up slightly, sending leaves swirling in tiny cyclones across the path, nature's way of suggesting that even after everything ends, something is always still moving.